Welcome back to Baking with Love. I'm Carolyn Stella, aka Stella, here in the PEG TV kitchen studio, and today I'd like to talk pumpkin spice. Now, some of you have probably been talking pumpkin spice since the middle of August, but I like to wait till November. The leaves are falling, the temps are getting crisper, and Thanksgiving's only a few weeks away. You may have noticed pumpkin spice is a thing. In the last 5 years, pumpkin spice food items have increased 47%. It's a $236 million industry. There's even studies about pumpkin spice. One study used Google search traffic for a 1-year period to take into account changes in weather conditions, and they ranked the states 1 through 50 for the most pumpkin spice obsessed. So let's take a look at the map of our beautiful country again. Last month we looked at it for the pronunciation of caramel and caramel, and you can see the states down south are the least pumpkin spice obsessed. And that makes sense because they don't really have the change of seasons that we do in New England and other parts of the country. For some reason, the #1 pumpkin spice obsessed state is West Virginia. Number 2 is our neighbor New Hampshire. We're number 3, our beloved Vermont. How can we let New Hampshire beat us at this? And number 4 was Nebraska, and Montana rounded out the top 5. So for all you pumpkin spice obsessed Vermonters out there, this is the show for you. So how long has pumpkin spice been around? Well, one historian found a reference to a spice mix in a cookbook in 1798. So it's been around a while, but this kind of pumpkin spice has been around on store shelves since about 1934. And they think it was pretty much a direct response to canned pumpkin puree becoming more available at the end of the 1920s. So what is in pumpkin spice? There's no pumpkin in pumpkin spice. There is a combination of spices that go great with pumpkin and with other squashes. But there's not just one pumpkin spice. So this one contains cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and allspice. And this is another store-bought pumpkin spice that contains cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg. So you can see there's a difference. And this is my pumpkin spice mix. Stella's pumpkin pie spice mix includes the love, and it includes a combination of 7 different spices. So I'd like to share my recipe for pumpkin pie spice today, and then we'll use it in our Bumpy Pumpkin Bread. So we'll just take a little bowl, and we'll add 3 tablespoons of ground cinnamon and 2 teaspoons of ground ginger, 1½ teaspoons of ground nutmeg, which 1½ teaspoons is ½ tablespoon, if you didn't know that. 1 teaspoon, oh, let me just show you what nutmeg is. If you've only had ground nutmeg before, nutmeg is a seed, and this is a nutmeg grater. So if you wanted to grate your own nutmeg, you could do that, but we're going to use the ground nutmeg today from the grocery store. Then we've got 1 teaspoon of ground cloves, which I probably should have brought a whole clove to show you that, but that one might be a little bit more familiar. 1 teaspoon of allspice. Are you familiar with allspice? It is from a berry of a tree that's in the myrtle family, and it's native to Jamaica. And it has kind of a combination of flavors of cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and pepper, and it goes great with their other spices. It actually is one of the spices in Jamaican jerk seasoning, but it goes great, like I said, with the pumpkin spices. So we'll add a teaspoon of allspice, and another lesser known spice, there's about 1/8 teaspoon here of ground mace. Mace is like the sister spice of nutmeg. Nutmeg is a seed, as we mentioned, and usually there's a covering on the seed, and that covering gets ground up, and it's what makes the spice mace. So nutmeg is one plant that gives us 2 spices, which is kind of unique. And then we have one of my secret ingredients, and I'm giving you all my secrets, ground white pepper, a little less than 1/8 teaspoon of ground white pepper, and then of course a generous pinch of love. So we always put the love in everything we do in this recipe. So I'm just going to mix it with a fork, and sometimes there's little lumps or clumps. The ginger especially tends to stick to itself, but once it's mixed, you can just use a funnel to transfer it to a clean, dry glass jar. This is probably a repurposed spice jar, maybe turmeric or something like that. So I'm going to add this spice mix to this nice glass jar. It has a tight sealing lid, and then it can be stored in your pantry with your other spices. You can just mark the lid. You can draw a little pumpkin on the lid. You can mark it with a Sharpie, PPS, pumpkin pie spice, or maybe you can make fun little labels like I did for this jar. And you can have your own pumpkin pie seasoning. If you choose not to make your own mix, of course you can use the store-bought one-to-one for this recipe. And also if you check the website for this recipe, I do include the individual amounts of each spice. So if you don't want to make a mix or even buy a store-bought mix, you can use your individual spices. And if you don't have mace or one of the other ones, you can kind of up the amounts of the other ones. So I'll just move some of these over to the back counter to get them out of our way. And now we're going to talk about our Bumpy Pumpkin Bread recipe in which we're going to use our pumpkin pie spice mix. So what's Bumpy Pumpkin Bread? Well, it's how I like mine, with stuff in it. If you are a pumpkin bread purist and you want to make this same recipe smooth, feel free to leave out the bumps. But the bumps I'm going to add are 2/3 of a cup chopped toasted pecans. These are already chopped and toasted. We talked a little bit about toasting nuts in our last episode when we used our walnuts for our Stellalitas. We're going to use a 1/2 cup of plumped chopped raisins. Now, this is an extra step. It's kind of where the love comes in. You don't have to do it, but sometimes if you go to your pantry, you check your raisins, they've been there a while, they get a little dry and a little chewy. So plumping raisins is a nice touch, and today I'm going to plump them with a little orange juice. So I'm just going to put a splash of OJ in this microwave-safe bowl, and we're going to cover it and pop it in the microwave for 30 to 45 seconds. You can do this also on the stove top if you'd like. You could do it with just water. You could do it with apple cider or apple juice. It just reconstitutes the raisins a little bit. It makes them a little more tender, and in this way we also give it that nice orange essence. So we're going to take out our plumped raisins and let them cool, because we don't use them until we're ready for our batter. So we'll leave them here, and before we use them, we'll chop them up. And then we also, my third bump is crystallized ginger. So I love this flavor in my pumpkin bread. Mine usually come in chunks like this. Yours might be slices. And I just dice it up a generous 1/4 cup. And then I also use 2 or 3 tablespoons of diced crystallized ginger in my streusel topping. So we're going to make the streusel next. Again, I like bumps inside my pumpkin bread, and I like bumps on top of my pumpkin bread. If you choose not to make the streusel, that's fine, or you can leave these bumps out and just do the bumpy top. So we're going to use a food processor today for our streusel. Streusel is actually a German word that means scattered or strewn about. So we're going to make our streusel crumb topping, and then we're going to scatter it on top of our batter. So we're going to use 6 tablespoons of all-purpose flour, 6 tablespoons of granulated sugar, and this is a generous amount of streusel. It'll depend on what container you end up making your pumpkin bread in. We might have a little extra today, but if you end up making muffins, you'll probably want this much. 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter. It could be cold. We talked about room temperature butter last time, but this can be right out of the fridge and diced up. So we'll just pulse it a little bit, give it a mix, and then start to add our butter. I know I could add it through the tube, but sometimes it gets stuck. So we'll add a little butter, give it a pulse, add a little butter, and we'll start to see our crumbs form. Add a little more. Do our butter in 3 parts today. And again, you can pulse it on and off. You can do a little bit longer pulses. And you can see it start to come together. It'll start to kind of creep up the sides of the food processor bowl. So this is our last bit of butter. Give it a good mix. And then right at the end, we'll add our crystallized ginger that's chopped up. Yeah, you can see it's starting to make the crumbs. So we'll add the ginger, and maybe I'll just give it a little swirl along the edges to make sure any of the powdery flour gets in this little last whirl. And that's coming together nicely. So that's going to be our streusel crumb topping. And we'll leave that now. We'll start our batter. So we've got our bumps, we've got our streusel. Now for the batter. We're going to take a large bowl and add our dry ingredients. So we've got 1 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 tablespoon, generous tablespoon of our pumpkin pie spice that we just made, or store-bought, or the individual spices that I mentioned, and 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. We'll get our fork again and just whisk this together. So do you know, if you look on Amazon for pumpkin spice food items, there are over 138,000. There's pumpkin spice in everything now. Pumpkin spice in beer, pumpkin spice in cereal, pumpkin spice in Pringles. There's even pumpkin spice in Spam. So we've got our dry ingredients, but I think it belongs in pumpkin bread. Now we will do our wet ingredients. There's a couple dry ingredients in here. 2 eggs, 2 large eggs at room temperature. 1/2 cup of granulated sugar. 3/4 of a cup of firmly packed dark brown sugar. We talked a little bit about firmly packing our sugar in our last episode. We'll just start to swirl this a little bit, break up the egg yolks. And then we're going to add a 1/2 cup of oil and a 1/4 cup of orange juice. So there we've got that nice orange juice flavor again that we used to plump our raisins. So we'll get this going and get our sugars all combined and broken up. You might still have a few lumps of the dark brown sugar. And then the star of the show, especially this time of year, 1½ cups of pureed pumpkin. You can use the can that we mentioned earlier, or you can go with fresh. I'm using a little bit of can today, and we'll just mix that all in, and we'll have our nice pumpkin goo. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier with our spices, our generous cup of love. So we'll just put the love in and mix all of this together. Once you have a good mix in this bowl, you're going to add your wet ingredients to your dry ingredients. That looks nice. And again, I'm going to use the fork, and then I'll use my rubber spatula. You don't need a mixer, so we did use our food processor today, but again, don't have a lot of things to clean up or wash after this. You can use your fork and just kind of gently pour this all into the flour mixture. There's a little brown sugar. And then I'll continue mixing with my spatula. And you want to make sure that all the flour is incorporated and you don't see any little flour lumps. Scrape from the bottom up to make sure it's all blended. Sometimes when you put the flour in first, there's some sticking to the bottom that doesn't get in. And you're just going to keep mixing until there might be some lumps, but there aren't any bumps yet because we didn't add them. They're over on my left. So I'm just going to keep mixing, breaking up any little flour bombs that you see, so that when people bite into your loaf, it's all nice and uniform and pumpkin-y. I wish you could smell these spices. These are all nice warm spices for this time of year, and they just remind me of fall, and probably all of those other pumpkin spice Vermonters, obsessed Vermonters as well. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now we're going to add our bumps. So we still have to chop our raisins, but we can add our pecans and give that a little stir. And again, if you really want it smooth, or if you want to not have it as bumpy, you might just stop at the nuts. Let's do our raisins now. Let's see. We're going to have to drain this. That's our orange juice. There's a little excess, so we'll just put it into here. I'll just use my hand to give them a little squeeze. It's still warm, but not hot. If you did it right away, you probably wouldn't be able to handle it. And then we'll just, now you don't have to chop them either, but again, I like it for the texture, for the uniformity of the texture. So I'm just gonna just chop these up a little bit and then add them to our batter. So again, this is a little bit of the extra work, but I think it's really worth it. So we'll just chop these up, and that way, when you bite into it, you'll get a little piece of pecan, a little piece of raisin, a little piece of crystallized ginger, and it'll all be the right texture. So we'll just give those a nice chop, and they're nice and plump, and I can also smell a little of that orange juice essence, so that's nice. And then we'll just add these into our bowl. I'm going to do it this way so that none of them go splurting out. And finally, our crystallized ginger. So we'll give that another mix. We've got our nuts, we've got our raisins, and our third bump is our minced crystallized ginger. Sometimes ginger has a little fibrous stuff. I see a couple fibers there. I'm going to pull those out just because they caught my eye. But when they bake, people won't notice. All right, now we've got to talk about our shape. What are we going to make? Well, this recipe would make one nice big 9 by 5 inch loaf pan. It would also make 15 to 18 standard size muffins. So if I was to make the muffins today, I would use the paper cups. And if you have a big muffin pan, I call these mega muffins, you could also make probably 8 to 10 of the mega muffins. But today I'm going to make mini loaves. I like mini loaves. They make gifts if you're going somewhere for a visit. This pumpkin bread freezes really well, so you can keep one out and enjoy it, and then just freeze the others and take it out the night before, let it come to room temperature. It'll still be fresh and delicious tasting, or they make great gifts. So if you're going to visit someone, you can take them a pumpkin bread and sit and have a visit and a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. So we're just going to divide our batter evenly between the 4 mini loaf pans. They've already been sprayed with the non-stick cooking spray. Did that little prep. Some people are sticklers about this, and they put it on their kitchen scale and weigh each one so that they know they have the exact amount of batter and they'll all bake at the same time. I'm gonna eyeball it, and hopefully we'll get it pretty even. So we'll just fill up our loaf pans like so. Move on to pan number 2. You can see the bumps. That's all the good stuff. Number 3. And then I'll go back and kind of even them out a little bit. Number 4. And we'll see which one needs a little more. Maybe number 3. And we already preheated. I mentioned that we already sprayed the mini loaf pans with non-stick cooking spray. That would be one of the first things that you do. Decide what size you're making and get your pans ready, and then also preheat your oven to 350. So I also did that earlier. All right. We've got our pumpkin bread batter in our mini loaf pans. They look pretty even. Stick that in the sink so we have some room. And now we're going to use our streusel mixture to make a nice crumb topping. So you can see that this kind of clumped up a little bit, and as you pick it up, you can kind of bunch it up into bigger crumbs, and then you can kind of disperse it as you like. So you can kind of give it a squish, and then just break off pieces and scatter it around. So this is what streusel is, and this can be used on other breads as well. This works great with or without the crystallized ginger. You can use it on zucchini bread. You can use it on banana bread, muffins. So this is a pretty universal streusel recipe. And yeah, like I said, I like bumps. So here we go, bumping up the top of each loaf. And again, you can make them bigger or smaller. Sometimes it's a little more crumbly. Sometimes it's a little more sticky, but the butter will kind of hold it all together and the batter will kind of pop up around it, so it'll make a really nice topping. And like I said, this was a generous amount because if you were to make the muffins, you would probably need more, and if you were to make the bigger loaf, you'd probably need less. So if you need to half the recipe for a large 9x5 loaf, feel free, and those instructions are also in the recipe, and the recipe's on our website. So we'll just keep crumbling, 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 until we have a nice amount on each loaf. And if you wanted to do a couple smooth tops, you could do that too. So again, you could adjust your crumbs accordingly if you want to do half with and half without, for people that might be less likely to enjoy the streusel, but who doesn't like the streusel? All right, I'm going to give my hands a wipe. And we're going to put these in the center rack of our 350-degree oven. I put them all on the center rack and bake them for about 40 to 45 minutes. So the timing of the other sizes will vary, and that's also in the recipe on the website. Halfway through, I would probably rotate these, maybe front to back, and check them with our toothpick to make sure that they're done and not overdone, because you want them to be nice and moist. So from the magic of a TV, 45 minutes have gone by, and now we have our beautiful mini loaves, and we would put them on our, use your imagination, these are just done, and we're going to cool them on our baking rack. And then for about an hour, and then when they are cool, we're going to probably just need to run a butter knife or something around the edge and jiggle them a little bit, and they should pop right out like that. So we have Bumpy Pumpkin Bread with streusel topping, made with our very own Stella's proprietary pumpkin spice blend. That one's a little sticky. Let me wiggle it a little more. And I'm going to slice into these so you can see how they look. Some people like the ends. They say it reminds them of muffins. Some people say they like the middle slices. So you've got something for everyone. Oh, a couple bumps fell off. There we go. And as I said, I like to freeze these, so if you're going to freeze them, you could just wrap it up in foil and put it in a Ziploc bag. I already have this one labeled BPB, Bumpy Pumpkin Bread, and they freeze really nicely. And as I mentioned, we're going to slice into this now and see the bumps. So we'll get our cutting board. Oh, I forgot to mention, this just happened when I was cutting up the crystallized ginger. I didn't do anything to shape these, but they turned out to be perfect hearts. So we had a little extra love in our recipe here today. So now we'll cut these up. Here's our one for the freezer. And you'll see our nice, moist, and bumpy pumpkin bread. And again, you can do, there's those bumps. Raisins, pecans, and crystallized ginger. And again, you can make them bigger slices or smaller slices depending on your eaters. But it's so nice and moist. Now, I always like to offer variations. I mentioned the smooth variation. Instead of the pecans, you can add little chocolate morsels. You could add white chocolate morsels. That would be 2/3 of a cup. Again, I mentioned the variations in the recipe. And, or you could do a combination. Some people might like nuts with their chocolate chips, and other people might want to just be a mini morsel purist. So that is Stella's Bumpy Pumpkin Bread, Stella's Pumpkin Pie Spice Mix, Streusel Topping for a little extra bumpy, and I hope you have a nice holiday season. Again, this would be a great bread to bring to a Thanksgiving or a brunch, and no matter what you're making, I hope you remember to add the love. So thanks for watching. Hope to see you again next month.